You've probably felt hungry today. Maybe you skipped breakfast, maybe lunch got pushed back an hour, and by 2 p.m. you were irritable, a little shaky, Googling the fastest delivery near you. That's not hunger. That's mild inconvenience. Real hunger, the kind that lasts for days, not hours, is something almost none of us have ever experienced. But for most of human history, it wasn't rare. It wasn't even unusual. It was a regular, expected part of being alive. Ancient humans didn't eat 3 meals a day like clockwork. They ate when there was food. And when there wasn't, they had to survive on nothing, sometimes for a very long time. And the strange part is, the human body wasn't just built to tolerate that. It was built to expect it. So what actually happens to a person, physically, mentally, socially, when the food runs out? Let's go back to the beginning. For roughly 300,000 years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. There was no stockpile, no fridge, no grain silo. Food existed where you found it, and finding it wasn't guaranteed. A hunt could fail. A drought could wipe out the plants you depended on. A harsh winter could freeze the ground solid for months. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Kung in the Kalahari have found that even in relatively food-rich environments, these groups regularly go through stretches of a day or two with little to nothing to eat. Multiply that across thousands of generations in far harsher climates, and you start to understand something important. Starvation wasn't an emergency. It was a recurring condition of being human.
And your body remembers that, literally. When you stop eating, your body doesn't just running out. It shifts through stages, like a machine switching modes to keep you alive as long as possible. In the first several hours, your body burns through stored glucose in the liver. That's your quick-access fuel tank. Once that's gone, usually within about 24 hours, your body moves to stage 2. It starts breaking down fat stores and converting them into molecules called ketones, which your brain can actually run on instead of sugar. This is why, historically, some humans could survive for days on nothing but water and willpower. Fat wasn't just insulation. It was an emergency generator built directly into the body by evolution, specifically for moments like this. But fat runs out too. And when it does, the body moves to a much darker stage 3. It starts breaking down muscle for energy, cannibalizing its own tissue to keep the brain and heart running. This is where prolonged famine turns dangerous, not just weak, but structurally damaging. And this is where the archaeological evidence gets genuinely fascinating, because your bones remember it too.
Skeletons from prehistoric burial sites often show something called Harris lines, thin bands of dense bone visible on X-ray, which form when growth is interrupted and then resumes. They're essentially scars left behind by periods of serious malnutrition during childhood. Researchers studying skeletons from Ice Age Europe and Neolithic populations have found these lines again and again in site after site. It means the people living there weren't just occasionally hungry. Many of them, as children, went through stretches severe enough to physically pause their own growth, and then their bodies kept going anyway. There's another marker archaeologists look for: dental enamel hypoplasia. It's a kind of visible ridging or pitting on tooth enamel that forms when a child's body is under so much nutritional stress that even tooth development gets interrupted. When researchers examined remains from populations across the last ice age, a huge percentage showed this marker, some studies putting it well above half of individuals tested. That means starvation wasn't a tragic exception in ancient life. For a huge number of people, it was something they survived through more than once, starting in childhood. So the question isn't really, did ancient humans go hungry? They almost certainly did, repeatedly. The real question is, what did they actually do about it?
The first strategy was the most obvious one: eat things you'd normally ignore. When preferred food sources vanished, ancient humans didn't just sit and wait. They widened what counted as food dramatically. Archaeologists studying the diets of early humans through isotope analysis of bones, a method that reveals what someone actually ate over the last several years of their life, have found evidence of fallback foods. These are low-quality, hard-to-process, sometimes unpleasant foods that only show up in the diet when better options disappear. Things like tough roots, tree bark, and in several documented cases, insects and larvae. Insects, it turns out, are extremely calorie-dense and don't require hunting skill or luck, just the willingness to eat them. Modern hunter-gatherer groups still fall back on termites, grubs, and locusts during lean seasons, and there's no reason to think ancient humans behaved any differently. When the mammoth herd didn't show up, you ate what was under the log. The second strategy was more social than biological: sharing risk. This is one of the most important and most underrated survival adaptations humans ever developed. In a group that hunts and gathers, success is unpredictable. One person's hunt might fail while another succeeds. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer bands have found that meat in particular was almost always shared across the entire group, not hoarded by whoever caught it. This wasn't generosity for its own sake, it was insurance. If you share your surplus today, you're building a debt that gets repaid the day you come back empty-handed. Over the long run, a group that shares food survives famine far better than a group of individuals hoarding for themselves. Some anthropologists argue this pressure, the literal need to survive unpredictable hunger, is one of the forces that shaped human cooperation and social bonding in the first place. You didn't just band together for company, you banded together because a group that shares food outlives a group that doesn't. The third strategy shows up in the archaeological record in a much colder, more practical way: extreme rationing and preservation. Long before refrigeration, humans figured out how to make food last. Excavations at sites in Ice Age Europe have found evidence of meat caches, deliberately buried or submerged in cold water, essentially using the freezing environment as a natural freezer. Smoking and drying meat over fire extended it even further. And there's something almost unsettling about how far this rationing could go. Isotope studies on some Ice Age human remains suggest diets so heavily dependent on lean meat during lean seasons that researchers have raised the possibility of something called rabbit starvation, a real documented condition where a body fed almost nothing but very lean protein with no fat or carbohydrates actually starts to fail no matter how much of it you eat. It's a strange, brutal fact. Sometimes ancient humans had food, technically, and still weren't getting enough of what their bodies actually needed to survive.
Brutal fact? Sometimes ancient humans had food, technically, and still weren't getting enough of what their bodies actually needed to survive.
And then there's the part of this story that's harder to talk about, but archaeologists don't shy away from it: the evidence for survival cannibalism. At a site called Gough's Cave in England, dated to roughly 15,000 years ago, researchers found human bones bearing precise cut marks, the same kind of marks left on animal bones that had been butchered for meat. Some of the bones had even been shaped into cups. The prevailing theory isn't that this was some kind of horror movie ritual. Many researchers interpret it as evidence of desperate survival behavior during a period of extreme resource scarcity at the end of the last ice age, or possibly a ritual practice tied to how a group processed death, which is a genuinely open debate. Similar cut-marked human remains have turned up at other prehistoric sites across Europe. It's not proof that this was common. It's proof that in the worst-case scenario, when every other option had been exhausted, some ancient humans crossed a line that almost none of us will ever have to seriously consider. It tells you just how severe famine could actually get. There's also a psychological side to all of this that doesn't fossilize, but shows up in the behavior of hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists over the last century. Prolonged hunger changes how people think, not just how their bodies function. Studies on famine, including the famous Minnesota starvation experiment conducted in the 1940s, where healthy volunteers were deliberately semi-starved under controlled conditions, found that extended food scarcity produces intense preoccupation with food, irritability, anxiety, and a narrowing of focus down to one single goal: finding something to eat. Social bonds can fray under that kind of pressure, but in many documented hunter-gatherer cultures, food scarcity actually strengthens ritual and storytelling around meals, origin myths about hunger, taboos about who eats first, ceremonies tied to a successful hunt. Some anthropologists believe these rituals functioned as psychological tools, ways of managing anxiety and reinforcing group cohesion during the exact moments when cohesion mattered most for survival.
By the time agriculture appears, around 12,000 years ago, you'd think the food problem would be solved. It wasn't. In some ways, it got worse. Skeletal studies comparing early farming populations to earlier hunter-gatherers actually show a decline in height and an increase in markers of malnutrition after the switch to farming. Early agriculture meant relying on a small number of crops instead of a broad range of wild foods, which meant a single bad harvest could now threaten an entire settlement at once, instead of just one hunting party. Famine didn't disappear with civilization. In a lot of ways, civilization made a single failure more catastrophic than it had ever been for small, mobile hunter-gatherer groups. So here's the full picture. For hundreds of thousands of years, going hungry wasn't a crisis. It was baked into daily life, and the human body evolved specific layered systems to deal with it. Glucose reserves, then fat stores converted to ketones, then, as an absolute last resort, muscle itself. Ancient humans widened their diet to include anything with calories. They shared food as insurance against bad luck. They invented preservation methods to stretch scarce resources further. And in the most extreme, rarest cases, they made choices that are almost impossible for us to imagine from where we're sitting now, with a refrigerator down the hall. You've probably never gone more than a day without eating on purpose. Your ancestors sometimes went a week, and their bodies had a built-in plan for exactly that. Every time you feel starving because lunch is running late, you're using a word that used to mean something completely different, something your own biology was quietly built to survive.